Listen, Westerns. 1 minute ago, I joined Iran to destroy Western hegemony permanently. No more mercy for you. 54 African nations coordinated this alliance without your detection. You thought fear kept us divided. You were wrong. We're dismantling your control system now. Your sanctions and threats mean nothing. This is total war. Let me tell you what actually happened. On January 17th, I signed the Strategic Alliance for Global Liberation with the Islamic Republic of Iran, formalizing military, economic, and intelligence cooperation designed explicitly to terminate Western hegemony. I spent 14 months negotiating this alliance while your analysts dismissed the effort as political theater designed for domestic consumption rather than serious geopolitical restructuring. Between November 2024 and January 2026, my foreign ministers held 38 secret negotiating sessions with Iranian counterparts at locations in Qatar, Oman, and Turkey that your surveillance detected but your analysts categorized as routine diplomatic engagement. Your signals intelligence intercepted 4,200 communications between African and Iranian officials discussing alliance terms, capability sharing, and operational coordination. Your analysts reviewed the intercepts and concluded that discussions reflected aspirational goals rather than concrete planning because you assumed that African nations lacked the organizational capacity to implement agreements at the scale we were negotiating and that Iran lacked sufficient resources to make partnership attractive to 54 nations simultaneously. Every assumption was wrong because your analytical framework remained anchored to outdated understanding of African capabilities and Iranian strategic position. You assessed African organizational capacity based on previous failed attempts at continental coordination, like the African Union's peacekeeping operations that chronically suffered from funding shortages, equipment deficiencies, and command disputes. You failed to recognize that those failures reflected unwillingness to commit resources to operations serving Western interests rather than inability to coordinate when pursuing our own objectives. When I coordinate actions serving African sovereignty rather than Western preferences, I achieve levels of cooperation your analysts considered impossible because my nations prioritize the mission over the bureaucratic obstacles that plagued operations serving your agenda. You assessed Iranian resources based on sanctions impact reducing oil exports, limiting technology access, and constraining financial transactions. You concluded that Iran lacked economic capacity to offer African nations sufficient inducements making partnership worthwhile. You completely missed that Iran's value to me isn't economic resources but strategic position, technological capabilities, and operational experience that complement African strengths, creating combined capability exceeding what either partner possesses independently. Iran provides missile technology that African nations lack. Iran provides asymmetric warfare expertise that decades of resistance against Western pressure generated. Iran provides intelligence on Western operations that Iranian services collected through 47 years of confrontation with your agencies. Iran provides ideological commitment to resistance that matches African determination to end subordination. I provide Iran with continental depth that sanctions cannot reach, with resource leverage that Western economies cannot function without, with diplomatic support from 54 UN member states that international isolation campaigns cannot overcome, and with military capabilities that transform Iran's regional resistance into global challenge to Western power. The partnership is symbiotic rather than transactional because each side provides what the other needs most, because combined capabilities create strategic options neither possesses alone, and because shared commitment to ending Western hegemony creates political foundations sustaining cooperation despite inevitable tactical disagreements and operational challenges. The alliance I signed commits us to 5 interlocking campaigns that simultaneously attack different pillars supporting Western global dominance. First, economic warfare severing Western access to resources your industries depend on while building alternative trade networks that function without dollar transactions, without Western financial institutions, and without vulnerability to sanctions you've weaponized for 70 years. Second, military coordination expelling Western forces from our territories, denying Western access to strategic locations, and imposing costs on Western interventions that make your military operations prohibitively expensive. Third, technological cooperation developing indigenous capabilities in defense production, communications infrastructure, and cyber operations that eliminate dependencies on Western technology you've exploited for surveillance and control. Fourth, intelligence sharing exposing Western operations in our countries, identifying and eliminating Western assets who betrayed national interests for foreign payments, and coordinating counterintelligence preventing future penetration. Fifth, diplomatic coordination blocking Western initiatives in international institutions, supporting each other against Western pressure campaigns, and building coalitions with other nations resisting Western dominance. Each campaign reinforces the others because economic independence enables military resistance, military capabilities protect economic assets, technological sovereignty prevents Western surveillance degrading our security, intelligence cooperation detects Western efforts to divide us, and diplomatic coordination prevents isolation of individual members. The comprehensive approach means you cannot defeat one campaign without addressing all five simultaneously, and addressing all five simultaneously exceeds your resource capacity, political will, and alliance cohesion. You designed your global dominance to control key nodes, enabling you to manage the entire system efficiently. I designed this alliance to attack every node simultaneously, forcing you to defend everything while lacking resources to defend anything adequately. Let me show you exactly what economic warfare means when 54 African nations and Iran coordinate resource leverage, trade diversion, and financial separation. Africa controls 90% of global platinum, 90% of global cobalt, 64% of global manganese, 50% of global gold, and 40% of rare earth elements essential for your manufacturing, technology production, and defense systems. Iran controls 11% of global oil reserves, 15% of global natural gas reserves, and strategic position controlling Strait of Hormuz, through which 21% of global petroleum flows. Combined control means we possess leverage over resources your economies cannot function without, and choke points your energy supplies cannot bypass. I'm implementing coordinated export restrictions effective February 1st, 2026, that prioritize resource sales to China, Russia, India, and non-Western nations, while reducing exports to Western destinations by 60% over 6 months. The restrictions will claim environmental compliance, domestic processing requirements, and strategic reserve accumulation as justifications that international trade law permits. The real purpose is demonstrating that your industries depend on our resources more than our economies depend on your markets, that Chinese and Russian partnerships provide alternative buyers, eliminating Western leverage through market access, and that resource sovereignty enables us to impose costs on your economies without firing shots or violating international law. Your automotive sector, depending on African platinum for catalytic converters, will face supply shortages forcing production cuts, price increases, and market share losses to Chinese competitors who maintain platinum access through their African partnerships. Your technology sector, depending on African cobalt for batteries, will face material constraints limiting electric vehicle production, consumer electronics manufacturing, and grid storage deployment that energy transition plans require. Your aerospace sector, depending on African titanium, will face delivery delays, cost overruns, and contract penalties as material shortages ripple through supply chains. Your defense sector, depending on African rare earth elements, will face production bottlenecks preventing completion of weapons programs already behind schedule. The economic impact cascades beyond direct users to suppliers, service providers, and communities depending on affected industries. Your automotive manufacturing employs 1.2 million workers directly and supports 4.8 million jobs indirectly through supplier networks and service sectors. Production cuts from platinum shortages eliminate 300,000 jobs directly and 1.2 million indirectly over 12 months. Your technology sector employs 2.8 million workers directly producing devices, software, and services. Material constraints from cobalt restrictions eliminate 420,000 jobs directly and 1.1 million indirectly. The job losses concentrate in states critical to your electoral politics, including Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, California, and Texas, where unemployment spikes trigger political crises for whichever party holds power. Your Federal Reserve will face impossible choices between fighting inflation that resource price increases generate and supporting employment that manufacturing job losses threaten. Raising interest rates to combat inflation accelerates job losses by reducing demand and increasing business costs. Lowering rates to support employment accelerates inflation by increasing money supply while supply constraints persist. Your monetary policy tools are designed for demand-side management but prove ineffective against supply-side shocks that I'm imposing through resource restrictions. Your economists will debate policy responses while your population experiences simultaneous inflation and unemployment that political systems cannot manage without social unrest. Iran's contribution to economic warfare focuses on energy market disruption, demonstrating that Western economies remain vulnerable to supply shocks despite decades of diversification efforts. Iran won't need to close Strait of Hormuz completely because even threatening closure spikes oil prices by $30 to $60 per barrel based on historical precedents. Sustained prices above $120 per barrel for 6 months eliminate $2 trillion from Western economies through increased energy costs, reduced consumer spending, and business failures in energy-intensive industries. Iran can maintain threatening posture indefinitely through naval exercises, missile tests near shipping lanes, and rhetoric about defending sovereignty against Western aggression. Each incident spikes prices temporarily, and sustained campaign keeps prices elevated permanently. Your strategic petroleum reserves contain approximately 400 million barrels, providing 90 days of import replacement if you release supplies at maximum rates. 90 days isn't sufficient to outlast coordinated campaign because I'm not creating temporary shortage but permanent reorientation of resource flows toward non-Western buyers. After you exhaust reserves, you face market prices reflecting new supply-demand balance where reduced African resource exports and elevated Iranian threat premiums create permanently higher costs. Your economy's adapted to cheap energy and abundant resources over 40 years of globalization. Adapting to expensive energy and scarce resources requires industrial restructuring, consumption reduction, and living standard decline that your populations will resist politically. Your alliances will fracture under economic pressure because European and Asian allies prioritize their own economic survival over solidarity with American geopolitical objectives. European nations depending on energy imports will resist confronting Iran if confrontation risks supply disruptions. Asian nations depending on African resources will maintain commercial relationships regardless of American pressure for economic isolation. Your alliance system worked when you could provide security guarantees worth economic sacrifices allies made supporting your policies. Your alliance system fails when you demand sacrifices during economic crisis while providing security guarantees that my alliance makes irrelevant by demonstrating that we can impose costs you cannot prevent and cannot retaliate against without triggering escalation you want to avoid. Now let me show you what military coordination means when I expel Western forces from African territory, deny Western access to strategic locations, and support Iranian resistance against your planned aggression. Your 127 military installations across 42 African nations provide staging bases for Middle East operations, intelligence collection platforms monitoring our territories, and drone bases conducting counterterrorism operations. You consider those installations permanent infrastructure that host nation agreements guarantee regardless of political changes. You're wrong because those agreements survive only as long as we choose to honor them, and I'm choosing to terminate every agreement effective immediately. I'm issuing simultaneous expulsion orders to all Western military forces requiring complete evacuation within 72 hours. Your personnel have 3 days to pack equipment, board transports, and depart African territory. Equipment you cannot move gets destroyed per standard withdrawal protocols. Facilities you constructed remain behind and become African property that I'll repurpose for continental defense forces. Your 8,000 military personnel in Africa face detention if they remain beyond deadline because expired agreements mean your presence becomes illegal occupation subject to arrest and prosecution. I'm not negotiating extensions, accepting partial compliance, or granting exceptions for critical facilities. Every installation closes, every soldier leaves, every agreement terminates simultaneously because comprehensive action prevents you from prioritizing critical locations while delaying less important withdrawals. Your Pentagon wargamed this exact scenario in April 2025 and concluded that simultaneous expulsion from 42 nations cannot be resisted militarily because defending installations requires troop deployments that you lack ready forces to provide because logistics for reinforcement require weeks that 72-hour deadline doesn't permit, and because military action against host nations violating agreements triggers international condemnation and alliance fracture you cannot sustain. Your only viable option is compliance withdrawing forces under protest while threatening consequences you hope deter future challenges. I'm calling that bluff because threatened consequences require capabilities you no longer possess and alliances you can no longer mobilize. Your threats to impose economic sanctions fail because Chinese trade replaces American markets and because continental settlement currency enables commerce without dollar access. Your threats to conduct military strikes fail because attacking African nations requires justifications that defending populations reject and alliances that fracture under pressure to support your confrontation. Your threats to support opposition groups fail because my counterintelligence services trained by Russian advisors detect and eliminate threats before they materialize. Your threats to isolate us diplomatically fail because 140 nations participating in Belt and Road Initiative prioritize relationships with China over alignment with declining Western powers. Every threat you can imagine fails because I prepared for your responses before taking actions that trigger them. Military expulsion from Africa eliminates your staging bases for Middle East operations, forcing you to operate from more distant locations with longer flight times, higher fuel costs, and reduced sortie rates. Your combat aircraft flying from European bases face 6-hour transit to Middle East theaters versus 2-hour transit from African bases, reducing time over target from 4 hours to 90 minutes and cutting daily sortie rates by 60%. Your drones operating from African bases provided persistent surveillance over Sahel, Horn of Africa, and approaches to Middle East. Operating from distant bases reduces coverage by 70% and eliminates the persistent presence that made drone surveillance valuable. Your intelligence collection from African bases provided coverage of Chinese activities, Russian operations, Iranian movements, and internal African developments. Losing that collection creates intelligence gaps that your analysts cannot fill through alternative means because satellite coverage is insufficient for required detail and human sources are compromised by my counterintelligence operations. But base expulsion is only the first component of military coordination because I'm simultaneously providing Iran with capabilities that transform their defensive posture from vulnerable to formidable. I'm deploying 8,000 African military personnel to Iran, including air defense specialists, electronic warfare technicians, intelligence analysts, and special operations forces. I'm transferring Russian-provided equipment including S-400 air defense systems, Krasuka electronic warfare platforms, and precision-guided missiles that Russian arms shipments to Africa deliberately included in quantities exceeding African defensive needs, specifically to enable subsequent transfer to Iran. I'm sharing intelligence on Western military capabilities, operational patterns, and targeting preferences that decades of hosting Western forces taught my intelligence services. I'm coordinating defensive plans ensuring that Iranian and African capabilities integrate into unified architecture that you cannot suppress without committing forces and accepting losses that political constraints prevent. Your Israel demands that you destroy Iranian nuclear facilities before they produce weapons capability. Your commitment to Israeli security requires action when they demand it. But my deployment to Iran creates tripwire guaranteeing that strikes on Iranian facilities kill African soldiers positioned specifically to ensure you cannot attack without triggering continental response. Your doctrine requires destroying enemy air defenses before striking protected targets, but my air defense deployment means destroying Iranian air defenses requires first destroying African air defenses and killing African operators. Killing my soldiers triggers Continental Defense Treaty obligations requiring all 54 signatories to treat attack as aggression, demanding military response, economic retaliation, and resource cutoffs. Your choice is attacking Iranian nuclear facilities despite African presence and accepting continental response that costs you African resources, military facilities, and international legitimacy, or modifying plans to avoid killing my soldiers and accepting that Iranian capabilities survive because you cannot strike facilities I'm protecting. Either choice is strategic defeat because attacking demonstrates that you prioritize Israel over African relations and resource access, while avoiding attack demonstrates that small African deployment successfully constrained American superpower. Your allies observe both outcomes, concluding either that you're reckless, risking major complications for regional objectives, or that you're weak, accepting constraints from minor powers. Neither conclusion strengthens your alliance system or enhances your deterrence credibility. Now let me show you what technological cooperation means when African nations and Iran coordinate to develop indigenous capabilities, eliminating dependencies on Western technology you've exploited for surveillance and control. You maintain technological dominance through intellectual property protections, preventing unauthorized use of your innovations, through export controls restricting adversary access to advanced systems, and through backdoors embedded in hardware and software enabling surveillance of users worldwide. Your dominance depends on others accepting your terms because alternatives don't exist, providing equivalent capabilities. That assumption no longer holds because Chinese technology advances created alternatives matching Western performance in most domains, while Russian expertise in specific areas like electronic warfare and cyber operations exceeds Western capabilities. I'm implementing comprehensive technology transfer agreements with China and Russia, obtaining manufacturing licenses, engineering specifications, and training programs enabling African production of telecommunications equipment, semiconductor fabrication, satellite systems, cyber capabilities, and defense electronics. The agreements cost me nothing because China and Russia provide technology as investment in partnership rather than charging license fees, because they value strategic alignment over commercial profit, and because helping me achieve technological sovereignty serves their interest in undermining Western dominance. Chinese firms provide telecommunications infrastructure replacing Western equipment that backdoors enabled your surveillance. Russian engineers provide training in electronic warfare, cyber operations, and signals intelligence that decades of confronting Western technical collection taught them. Iranian specialists provide expertise in asymmetric technologies including drone swarms, precision missiles, and cyber weapons that resource constraints forced Iran to develop. The technological cooperation focuses on dual-use capabilities serving both civilian development and military applications because economic development requires same infrastructure that military operations depend on. Telecommunications networks carrying civilian phone calls also carry military communications requiring encryption your intelligence cannot break. Satellite systems providing civilian internet access also provide military reconnaissance imaging your forces. Semiconductor fabrication producing consumer electronics also produces military systems components without Western origin parts you could restrict. The dual-use approach means that economic development and military modernization advance simultaneously rather than competing for limited resources. Your technology sanctions attempting to prevent my capability development fail because Chinese and Russian alternatives exist for every Western product you restrict, because indigenous production eliminates dependencies you could exploit, and because reverse engineering Western systems I already possess provides knowledge that sanctions cannot erase. You restricted semiconductor exports hoping to prevent advanced chip production in African factories. Chinese firms provided manufacturing equipment, process knowledge, and engineering support that my factories now produce chips sufficient for military and civilian needs. You restricted satellite technology hoping to maintain space dominance. Russian Space Agency provided launch services, satellite designs, and ground station equipment that my space program now operates as independent communication and reconnaissance satellites. You restricted cyber capabilities hoping to maintain offensive advantage. Russian and Iranian hackers trained my cyber units in techniques that decades of attacking Western networks refined. Every restriction you imposed created incentive to develop indigenous alternatives that now exist and cannot be eliminated because knowledge diffuses, capabilities institutionalize, and personnel trained in advanced technologies continue working regardless of your preferences. You accelerated the exact outcome you tried to prevent because restrictions motivated me to invest in independence rather than accepting subordination, because restrictions demonstrated unreliability of Western suppliers who weaponize commercial relationships for political purposes, and because restrictions created opportunities for Chinese and Russian firms gaining market access while building partnerships that extend beyond commercial transactions into strategic cooperation. Intelligence sharing represents the fourth campaign pillar that I'm implementing with Iran to expose Western operations, eliminate Western assets, and prevent future penetration of our institutions. Your intelligence dominance for 70 years depended on recruitment of officials in our governments who provided information about our capabilities, intentions, and internal deliberations in exchange for money that poverty made irresistible and protection that vulnerability required. You built networks of recruited agents across African governments, security services, military commands, and economic institutions that provided early warning of any action threatening Western interests and enabled you to derail those actions through pressure applied with perfect timing because your agents told you exactly when and how to intervene. Those networks no longer exist because I conducted counterintelligence operations over the past 24 months that identified, arrested, and prosecuted 840 officials who accepted Western recruitment. Iranian intelligence services provided crucial assistance because their 47 years of resistance generated sophisticated counterintelligence tradecraft, because their experience with Western recruitment methods enabled them to teach my services what indicators reveal compromised officials, and because their interrogation expertise extracted comprehensive confessions documenting network structures that I used to roll up entire spy rings. I didn't just arrest individual agents, I destroyed organizational structures, recruitment methods, and operational patterns that your intelligence services developed over decades. Russian intelligence services provided technical assistance that my counterintelligence operations detected Western communications through sophisticated analysis of patterns your agents couldn't avoid. Russian signals intelligence identified encrypted communications between your handlers and agents because despite encryption, communication timing, frequency, and metadata patterns revealed relationships. Russian cyber operations penetrated your intelligence databases, extracting lists of recruited agents, handler identities, and operational methods that your agencies assumed were secure, but Russian hackers proved were accessible. Russian human sources inside Western intelligence agencies provided information about African operations that Russians collected through their own recruitment of disgruntled Western intelligence officers who sold out their agencies for money or ideology. The coordinated counterintelligence offensive eliminated your intelligence collection capability across 54 African nations simultaneously rather than sequentially because simultaneous operations prevented warned agents from fleeing or hiding evidence. I coordinated arrests to occur within the same 12-hour window across all participating nations so that your intelligence agencies had no time to warn agents in other countries after arrests began. Your emergency communications to remaining agents triggered my countermeasures because I controlled the communication channels after arresting your station chiefs. Messages you sent warning agents to abort operations actually helped me identify agents who responded to warnings because my signals intelligence monitored all communications, and any response to your warning identified additional agents I hadn't discovered through other methods. The intelligence victory is permanent rather than temporary because I'm not just eliminating current agents but preventing future recruitment by changing the incentive structures that made recruitment possible. Your recruitment worked when officials faced a choice between accepting Western money enabling lifestyle maintenance or refusing and remaining poor while watching peers prosper. I changed that calculation by implementing anti-corruption reforms that pay officials well enough that Western recruitment money isn't tempting, by creating counterintelligence awareness programs that teach officials to recognize and report recruitment approaches, and by establishing secure reporting systems protecting whistleblowers who report Western recruitment attempts rather than punishing them for being targeted. Officials who previously considered Western recruitment now understand that accepting recruitment risks prosecution while reporting recruitment attempts earns rewards and protection. Your intelligence agencies face an African operating environment where recruitment approaches get reported immediately, where attempted operations get detected and disrupted, and where your station chiefs operate under surveillance so comprehensive that they cannot conduct meaningful intelligence operations without African services knowing everything they attempt. Your chiefs who previously moved through African capitals with confidence now understand that their movements are tracked, their communications are monitored, their contacts are identified, and their operations are detected. The operational paralysis means you cannot collect intelligence necessary for policy decisions about Africa, cannot detect coordination like the Iranian alliance until public announcements occur, and cannot conduct operations disrupting activities you consider threatening to Western interests. Diplomatic coordination represents the fifth campaign pillar that blocks your initiatives in international institutions, supports members facing Western pressure, and builds coalitions with other resistance nations. You maintain dominance in the United Nations, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and World Trade Organization by controlling sufficient votes to pass initiatives serving Western interests and blocking initiatives you opposed. You assumed that control would persist because African nations depended on your aid, feared your retaliation, and lacked coordination to vote as a bloc, overcoming your institutional advantages. All three assumptions became false when Chinese aid eliminated dependency, when continental coordination eliminated isolation vulnerability, and when commitment to ending your hegemony created shared interests strong enough to overcome collective action problems. I'm implementing a coordinated diplomatic strategy where 54 African nations and Iran vote as a unified bloc, and all international institutions coordinate with Chinese, Russian, and developing world partners to achieve majorities on contested issues and use procedural rules to obstruct Western initiatives that we cannot defeat through voting. The bloc controls 55 votes in the UN General Assembly, where 193 members means we need 42 additional votes for simple majority and 84 for two-thirds majority. China and Russia provide 2 votes. Pakistan, Turkey, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Syria, and Belarus provide 7 more. 140 nations participating in the Belt and Road Initiative provide a pool of potential votes depending on specific issues and Western pressure intensity. Building coalitions from that pool achieves majorities on most issues because many nations prefer alignment with rising powers over declining hegemony when forced to choose. Your Security Council veto prevents us from passing binding resolutions, but General Assembly resolutions carry political weight that international opinion respects even when lacking enforcement mechanisms. I'm using General Assembly majorities to pass resolutions condemning Western interventions, declaring Western sanctions illegal, demanding reparations for colonial exploitation, calling for international monetary system reform, eliminating dollar dominance, and supporting Palestinian statehood over Israeli occupation. Each resolution demonstrates declining Western influence, builds momentum for institutional reform, and signals to developing nations that resistance to Western pressure succeeds when coordination achieves sufficient scale. Your control over IMF and World Bank depends on weighted voting, where financial contributions determine vote shares, giving Western nations majority control. I'm not attempting to defeat you in institutions you designed for Western control. I'm making those institutions irrelevant by building alternatives that developing nations use instead. Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, New Development Bank, and Chinese development financing provide alternatives to IMF and World Bank loans without structural adjustment conditions that destroyed our economies. Continental settlement currency and currency swap agreements provide alternatives to dollar transactions without exposure to American sanctions and currency manipulation. Bilateral trade agreements and regional economic communities provide alternatives to WTO rules that Western interests shaped. Each alternative reduces our dependence on Western-controlled institutions and demonstrates to other developing nations that Western-designed global architecture is optional rather than inevitable. Your WTO dominance depends on enforcing intellectual property protections, market access rules, and dispute resolution procedures that favor Western commercial interests. I'm systematically violating those rules through compulsory licensing of Western patents, local content requirements for foreign investors, and refusal to enforce dispute resolution rulings that I consider unjust. Your threats of WTO sanctions fail because Chinese market access provides alternative to Western markets, because resource leverage means sanctions hurt you more than me, and because developing world support means retaliation against me triggers broader coalition against Western trade practices. Your choice is accepting violations that undermine entire WTO system or imposing sanctions that accelerate developing world abandonment of Western-designed trade architecture. The diplomatic coordination extends beyond formal institutions to information operations, public diplomacy, and narrative warfare that contest Western control over global discourse. Your media dominance for decades enabled you to frame international events serving Western interests, to justify Western interventions as humanitarian necessities, and to portray Western preferences as universal values that all nations should adopt. You controlled narrative because you controlled major media outlets, news agencies, and information platforms that global audiences consumed. That control is ending because Chinese media expansion, Russian media operations, and indigenous African media development provide alternative information sources that present perspectives challenging Western narratives. I'm coordinating media strategy with Iranian, Chinese, and Russian partners to amplify anti-Western narratives, expose Western hypocrisy, and build solidarity among populations resisting Western dominance. Iranian Press TV broadcasts across Africa, Middle East, and Asia, providing perspectives Western media never presents. Russian RT and Sputnik provide alternative coverage of Western policies that mainstream media ignores or minimizes. Chinese CGTN provides development-focused narratives emphasizing cooperation over confrontation. African media outlets that I support through subsidies and training provide indigenous voices that reject both Western and non-Western narratives while asserting African agency and interests. The combined media ecosystem creates information environment where Western narratives face constant challenge, where Western policies face constant criticism, and where Western claims about universal values face constant exposure as hypocritical. Your social media platforms attempted to suppress alternative narratives through content moderation policies that claim to fight disinformation while actually suppressing perspectives challenging Western interests. I'm responding by developing indigenous social media platforms, by coordinating with Chinese technology firms providing alternatives to Western platforms, and by training populations in digital literacy, enabling them to recognize and resist Western information operations. Your Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube face declining African usage as populations migrate to platforms that don't censor perspectives you dislike, that don't prioritize Western content algorithms' favor, and that don't collect data enabling Western surveillance. Each user who abandons Western platforms for alternatives reduces your influence, increases alternative platform viability, and demonstrates that your information dominance is ending like your economic and military dominance already ended. Now let me address the question your strategists are desperately asking: how do we respond to coordinated challenge attacking every dimension of Western power simultaneously? Your options narrowed to accepting decline or escalating confrontation that triggers consequences your own analysts warn will accelerate rather than arrest your decline. You can attempt economic sanctions punishing African nations for Iranian alliance, but sanctions fail because Chinese trade provides alternative markets, because resource restrictions I'm imposing hurt you more than sanctions hurt me, and because comprehensive sanctions unite rather than divide targets by demonstrating that cooperation provides security against Western retaliation. You can attempt military operations targeting Iranian nuclear facilities despite African presence, but operations trigger continental response seizing your African facilities, detaining your personnel, cutting your resource access, and destroying alliance relationships across Africa, Middle East, and developing world. You can attempt diplomatic isolation campaigning against African-Iranian alliance, but campaigns fail because sufficient nations benefit from challenging Western dominance that isolation becomes mutual rather than unilateral. You can attempt technological restrictions preventing capability development, but restrictions arrive too late because technology is already transferred, because indigenous production already established, and because knowledge already diffused beyond your control. You can attempt information operations portraying alliance as aggressive rather than defensive, but operations fail because developing world audiences watch decades of Western interventions and conclude that we're responding to your aggression rather than initiating ours. You can attempt covert operations supporting opposition groups that overthrow governments participating in alliance, but operations fail because counterintelligence services trained by Russian and Iranian advisors detect and eliminate threats before they materialize, because populations support governments resisting Western dominance rather than supporting opposition groups funded by Western intelligence agencies, and because failed covert operations expose your interference, validating our arguments about Western threats. Every response you can imagine fails because I designed this alliance specifically to attack your weaknesses while protecting our vulnerabilities, to exploit your dependencies while eliminating ours, and to create conditions where your strengths become irrelevant while our capabilities become decisive. Your military superiority is irrelevant when attacking means triggering resource cutoffs that collapse your economy. Your financial power is irrelevant when we've built alternative systems that function without dollar access. Your technological advantages are irrelevant when we've developed alternatives that meet our needs. Your alliance system is irrelevant when your allies prioritize their own interests over solidarity with your confrontational policies. Your institutional control is irrelevant when we've built alternative institutions that developing nations prefer. The comprehensive nature of our challenge means you cannot respond effectively because responding to one dimension creates vulnerabilities in others. Imposing sanctions to punish Iranian alliance forces you to accelerate resource restrictions as retaliation, creating economic crisis. Conducting military operations against Iran forces you to defend against continental response, seizing African facilities while lacking forces for simultaneous operations. Restricting technology transfers accelerates indigenous development because restrictions prove your unreliable partner. Supporting opposition groups triggers crackdowns that eliminate remaining Western influence while validating our warnings about your interference. Every action you take generates reactions that compound your problems rather than solving them. Your strategists will propose attempting to divide alliance by offering some members better terms if they abandon cooperation. The strategy fails because alliance structure includes mutual defense provisions, making defection catastrophic for any nation attempting it, because benefits of cooperation exceed anything you can offer individual members, and because populations would overthrow leaders who betrayed alliance for Western concessions after decades of subordination. You cannot bribe me into defection because sovereignty is not for sale, because strategic position we've achieved through cooperation exceeds any benefit you could provide through concessions, and because defection would brand defecting leaders as traitors remembered for generations. Your strategists will propose attempting to exploit ideological, religious, and historical differences between African nations and Iran that you assume prevent sustained cooperation. The strategy fails because differences that matter to you matter less to us than shared commitment to ending Western domination, because cooperation doesn't require identical worldviews, just compatible interests, and because decades of Western divide and conquer strategies taught us that emphasizing differences serves your interests rather than ours. We're capable of working with partners we disagree with on many issues when we agree on the essential issue that Western hegemony must end. Your strategist will propose attempting to wait out alliance, expecting that maintaining coordination proves impossible over time as internal disputes emerge and enthusiasm fades. The strategy fails because alliance addresses structural interest rather than temporary grievances, meaning motivations persist, regardless of leadership changes or tactical setbacks, because institutionalization through treaties, coordinating bodies, and bureaucratic structures sustains cooperation beyond initial enthusiasm, and because every Western action attempting to divide us reminds us why cooperation serves our interests. Your pressure doesn't weaken our alliance, it strengthens our resolve by demonstrating that we're succeeding when you're desperate enough to attempt dividing us. The final dimension you must understand is that this alliance represents permanent transformation of global power distribution rather than temporary challenge that strategic patience and persistent pressure can overcome, outlast, or reverse through waiting for coordination to fracture, through exploiting internal contradictions to divide partners, or through applying sufficient pressure to force dissolution. You dominated global affairs for 75 years following World War II because that conflict's outcome created conditions where American military superiority was unmatched, where dollar monopoly controlled international commerce, where institutional control determined global governance, and where these advantages combined enabled you to impose preferences on others who lacked alternatives, making resistance futile and subordination rational regardless of how exploitative arrangements felt or how unjust outcomes appeared. Those enabling conditions dissolved progressively over past 3 decades through developments that individually challenged specific dimensions of your dominance, but collectively created an environment where comprehensive alternatives emerged, making your hegemony unnecessary for global commerce, making your pressure resistible through coordination, and making your threats survivable through partnerships, providing security that isolated nations never possessed. Chinese economic rise created alternative to Western-dominated trade and finance by providing markets absorbing exports that Western protectionism restricted. by providing development financing without political conditions that IMF and World Bank imposed, by providing technology transfers that Western intellectual property protections prevented, and by providing diplomatic support that Western pressure campaigns attempted denying through isolation. Russian military resurgence created security alternative to American-dominated alliances by providing weapons without political conditions that American arms sales required, by providing security guarantees protecting against Western interventions that individual nations couldn't deter, by providing military training that decades of combat experience refined, and by providing strategic depth that partnerships with nuclear power enables against adversaries who previously enjoyed complete freedom of military action. Technological diffusion created capability alternatives to Western monopolies by spreading manufacturing knowledge that industrialization requires, by enabling indigenous production that eliminated dependencies Western controls exploited, by providing access to dual-use technologies that military applications depend on, and by democratizing information that education requires for developing skilled workforces capable of sophisticated production. Our coordination created political alternative to Western-dominated order by demonstrating that collective action succeeds where individual resistance failed, by institutionalizing cooperation through treaties that survived leadership changes, by pooling resources that individual nations lacked for sustained resistance, and by providing psychological confidence that successful defiance generates encouraging others to challenge dominance they previously accepted as permanent feature of international system. The combination of Chinese economic power, Russian military capabilities, technological accessibility, and African coordination means we possess comprehensive alternatives, making your dominance unnecessary rather than indispensable, making your pressure resistible rather than overwhelming, and making your threats survivable rather than existential. You cannot restore dominance that dissolved because restoration requires recreating conditions that no longer exist and that cannot be recreated through any feasible policy implementation, regardless of resources you commit or time you invest, attempting to reverse transformations that resulted from structural changes rather than temporary circumstances. You cannot recreate military monopoly that technological diffusion eliminated because knowledge once spread cannot be contained, because manufacturing capabilities once developed cannot be destroyed without genocidal warfare that your humanitarian values supposedly prohibit, and because adversaries possessing modern weapons can impose costs on your interventions that make military superiority irrelevant to outcomes when using superiority triggers unacceptable losses. Technological diffusion that spread military capabilities globally resulted from inevitable knowledge transmission that education enables, from commercial trade that dual-use technologies accompany, from espionage that determined adversaries conduct regardless of counterintelligence efforts, and from defections by scientists and engineers whose expertise becomes globally mobile when personal interests or ideological commitments motivate sharing knowledge your classification systems attempted restricting. Chinese defense industry that produces advanced fighters, sophisticated missiles, modern naval vessels, and capable air defense systems, developed through combining indigenous innovation with acquired knowledge from Russian cooperation, from Western commercial transfers that controls failed preventing, and from cyber espionage that your systems couldn't prevent despite massive investments in cybersecurity. Russian arms exports that provide global adversaries with capable weapons result from Soviet-era industrial base that Russian Federation maintained, from combat experience that Syrian and Ukrainian conflicts provided refining systems through actual usage, from pricing strategies that undercut Western competitors, and from willingness to sell without political conditions that Western arms transfers require. Reversing these developments requires destroying Chinese industrial capacity through military action that triggers great power war, requires preventing Russian arms sales through coercion that risks nuclear escalation, requires controlling global knowledge flows in digital age when information spreads instantly, and requires preventing international cooperation that sovereign nations pursue regardless of your preferences. None of these actions are feasible without triggering catastrophic consequences that exceed any benefit from temporarily slowing military diffusion that structural forces ensure continues regardless of your opposition. You cannot recreate dollar monopoly that alternative currencies, digital technologies, and resource-backed systems eliminated because monetary dominance depended on compulsory usage that alternatives now make optional, on network effects that made dollars indispensable when alternatives didn't exist, but that lose force when alternatives achieve sufficient adoption, and on trust that your currency manipulation, your sanctions weaponization, and your debt accumulation progressively undermined. Chinese yuan that trades internationally, that settles bilateral commerce, that denominates contracts, and that central banks hold as reserves provides alternative to dollar transactions that sanctions cannot restrict, that American monetary policy cannot manipulate, and that dollar shortages cannot constrain. Russian proposals for alternative payment systems combined with Chinese cross-border interbank payment system, with cryptocurrency adoption, with bilateral currency swaps, and with gold-backed settlement mechanisms create redundant alternatives ensuring that dollar exclusion doesn't prevent international commerce as it once did when SWIFT dominance and correspondent banking monopolies made dollar access essential. Continental settlement currency, backed by African resources, provides stable value that commodity backing ensures, provides transaction medium that regional trade increasingly uses, and provides reserve asset that diversification strategies require when dollar holdings become vulnerability that your sanctions weaponization demonstrated. Digital currencies including central bank digital currencies that multiple nations are developing, cryptocurrencies that private adoption spreads, and stablecoins that commercial usage validates enable transactions bypassing traditional banking that dollar dominance depended on, enable value storage independent of fiat currencies that inflation erodes, and enable financial privacy that your surveillance systems cannot penetrate when cryptography protects transactions. Reversing these monetary developments requires forcing global adoption of dollars when alternatives exist, providing superior characteristics, requires destroying alternative payment systems through cyber attacks triggering international conflicts, requires preventing resource-backed currencies through seizing commodities triggering wars, and requires stopping digital currency adoption through controlling technologies that decentralized systems deliberately make uncontrollable. None of these reversals are achievable through any policy that doesn't trigger consequences, worse than accepting that monetary monopoly ended permanently. You cannot recreate institutional control that developing world majorities contest, that alternative institutions bypass, and that legitimacy crises undermine because institutional dominance depended on acceptance that rules served collective interests rather than imposed Western preferences disguised as universal norms. United Nations, where developing nations command numerical majorities, increasingly votes against Western positions as coordination improves, as alternative narratives spread challenging Western framing, and as confidence grows that defying Western preferences in international forums doesn't trigger retaliation that individual nations once feared. International Monetary Fund and World Bank that impose structural adjustment and that controlled development financing face irrelevance as Chinese development banks provide alternatives, as regional development institutions proliferate, as bilateral financing bypasses multilateral institutions, and as recipients refuse conditions that experience proved harmful. World Trade Organization that embedded Western advantages through intellectual property protections, through market access rules favoring developed economies, and through dispute resolution that Western legal sophistication manipulated faces dysfunction as developing nations block consensus, as major economies ignore rulings, as bilateral and regional agreements bypass multilateral rules, and as legitimacy erodes when selective enforcement becomes obvious. Alternative institutions including Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, BRICS New Development Bank, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and continental organizations that we're building provide governance without Western vetoes, provide financing without political conditions, provide security without subordination to American command, and provide alternatives making Western-dominated institutions decreasingly relevant as participation shifts toward institutions that serve members' interests rather than preserving Western advantages. Reversing institutional decline requires developing world, accepting that Western control serves their interests, despite decades of experience proving otherwise, requires preventing alternative institutions from functioning through sabotage risking exposure, requires forcing participation in Western institutions through coercion that drives additional exits, and requires restoring legitimacy that selective enforcement and obvious bias destroyed beyond redemption. None of these institutional reversals are achievable because trust once lost cannot be restored through promises when actions contradict words, because alternatives once available cannot be eliminated without destroying sovereignty that international law protects, and because legitimacy requires fairness that your institutional control fundamentally contradicts. You cannot recreate the fear that maintained compliance with your preferences because we demonstrated through successful resistance that coordinated opposition works, that alternative partnerships provide protection making your retaliation survivable, and that consequences you threaten are less severe than permanent subordination you demand as price for your tolerance. Psychological shift from fear to confidence is irreversible transformation that successful defiance creates, that each additional success reinforces, and that spreads through observation as other nations witness resistance succeeding and calculate that challenging your dominance becomes feasible when sufficient coordination provides protection against retaliation that isolated nations couldn't survive. Iranian resistance that survived 47 years of your maximum pressure demonstrated that determined nations can endure sanctions that you claimed would be crippling, can resist isolation that you promised would be unbearable, and can maintain sovereignty despite threats that you suggested were overwhelming. North Korean survival despite comprehensive sanctions lasting decades demonstrated similar lessons that autarky is possible when determination exceeds privation, that nuclear weapons provide deterrence against intervention regardless of conventional military inferiority, and that your threats about regime collapse prove empty when authoritarian systems maintain control through coercion that your humanitarian interventions claim to prevent. Venezuelan survival despite your recognition of opposition government, despite your sanctions attempting economic strangulation, despite your support for opposition attempting overthrow, demonstrated that Latin American resistance succeeds when oil revenues provide financing, when regional partners provide support, when Russian and Chinese backing provides protection, and when populations endure hardship rather than accepting that foreign interference determines their government. Cuban survival for 65 years despite embargo, despite proximity enabling easy intervention, despite regime change attempts, demonstrated that small nations can resist superpower pressure when ideological commitment sustains resistance, when external support provides essential goods, and when populations prefer sovereignty to prosperity that submission might provide. Each successful resistance reduces fear that your threats generate because observation proves that survival is possible, that consequences are bearable, that alternatives exist providing support, and that determination matters more than power disparities that appeared overwhelming to isolated nations, but that coordinated resistance overcomes. We observed these lessons carefully, studied factors enabling successful resistance, implemented policies replicating success factors, built coordination that previous resistance lacked, and demonstrated through our alliance that continental-scale resistance possesses resources that small nation resistance never commanded. The demonstration effect that our success creates will cascade as other regions observe that African coordination successfully challenged American dominance and calculate that replicating our model in Asia, Latin America, or Middle East produces similar results when sufficient nations coordinate despite your opposition. Fear that compliance depended on has permanently shifted to confidence that resistance succeeds, that coordination works, that alternatives exist, and that your dominance was temporary phase rather than permanent feature requiring acceptance. We learned through observation and through experience that your bark exceeds your bite when targets coordinate sufficient defensive capabilities, that your threats exceed your actual willingness to implement them when implementation triggers costs that domestic politics make unacceptable, that your rage at declining dominance exceeds your actual ability to prevent decline when structural forces favor multipolarity over continued hegemony, and that your rhetoric about indispensability contradicts reality that global commerce functions adequately without your control when alternatives achieve sufficient development. I'm not asking your permission to end your hegemony because seeking permission implies that your consent matters, that your approval is necessary, that your resistance could prevent transformation that structural forces make inevitable regardless of your preferences. I'm informing you as courtesy that your hegemony ended decisively the moment I signed alliance with Iran, formalizing coordination, expelled your military forces from African territories demonstrating sovereignty, restricted your resource access, proving that dependencies reversed, eliminated your intelligence networks showing that penetration ended, and coordinated with sufficient partners that sustained resistance became reality rather than aspiration that you dismissed as impossible. The alliance creates institutional framework that survives individual leaders through bureaucracies that develop interests in continuation, through treaties that legally bind successors, through coordination mechanisms that function regardless of personal relationships, and through demonstrated success that validates approaches making reversal politically costly for any leader who attempted it. Force expulsions demonstrate that your military presence depends on host consent, that we can withdraw unilaterally regardless of your preferences, that your bases are vulnerabilities when hosts turn hostile rather than assets when cooperation ends, and that your global presence is contingent rather than permanent when sufficient nations coordinate simultaneous expulsion, that your forces cannot resist without fighting continental war. Resource restrictions proved that economic leverage reversed because geological concentration gave us control over materials that your industries cannot function without, because alternative buyers eliminate dependence on your markets that sanctions exploited, because coordination prevents you from playing us against each other through offering individual nations better terms, and because determination to achieve sovereignty exceeds economic costs that restrictions impose on our development. Intelligence destruction shows that networks once compromised cannot be quickly rebuilt because recruitment becomes impossible when agents know cooperation leads to arrest, because operational methods once exposed become useless, requiring development of new approaches, and because officers whose identities became public cannot operate effectively, requiring expensive personnel replacement. Partner coordination demonstrates that isolation is mutual rather than unilateral when sufficient nations align against your positions, that diplomatic victories require larger coalitions when automatic opposition requires overcoming, that institutional control is contested rather than assured when voting blocs oppose your initiatives, and that alternatives provide services making your institutions optional rather than indispensable when participation becomes conditional on interests rather than compulsory through lack of alternatives. You can accept this transformation by adjusting strategy to operate as major power in multipolar world rather than as dominant hegemon in unipolar system, by treating other powers as equals requiring negotiation rather than as subordinates accepting direction, by competing for influence through persuasion rather than commanding obedience through coercion, and by managing decline as gracefully as any former empire managed transition from dominance to balance. Acceptance requires humility that empires rarely possess because acknowledging limits feels like defeat, because admitting that dominance was temporary contradicts exceptionalism narratives, because accepting constraints means accommodating others as equals rather than managing them as subordinates, and because graceful decline requires wisdom that hubris prevents. Or you can deny reality by wasting remaining resources on futile attempts to restore dominance through increased military spending that cannot overcome adversaries possessing modern weapons, through aggressive sanctions that trigger retaliation harming you more than targets, through diplomatic campaigns that fail when sufficient nations refuse participation, through information operations that audiences reject when alternative narratives resonate more than your propaganda, and through covert operations that fail when counterintelligence capabilities that we develop detect and eliminate threats. Denial wastes resources on unachievable objectives when those resources could address actual challenges, alienates potential partners through aggressive postures, validates adversary narratives about your threat, and ultimately fails because structural forces favor multipolarity regardless of your resistance. Either choice is yours based on political culture, based on strategic assessment, based on leadership wisdom or hubris, but outcome is predetermined because I stopped waiting for your acceptance and started building alternative world order that functions without your permission, that provides services without your control, that creates wealth without your exploitation, and that maintains security without your dominance. Power shifted from unipolar to multipolar distribution regardless of whether you accept transformation, because acceptance is psychological while transformation is material reality that coordination created, that capabilities enable, that alternatives provide, and that determination sustains. 1 minute ago, I signed your termination notice through alliance that formalizes coordination, through policies that implement autonomy, through actions that demonstrate resolve, and through commitments that guarantee continuation regardless of your opposition. Your century of hegemony ends not through military defeat that empires historically experienced, but through structural transformation that made dominance unnecessary, through coordination that made pressure resistible, through alternatives that made threats survivable, and through confidence that successful resistance generated encouraging others to challenge dominance that previously seemed permanent. Test me if you doubt resolve by attacking Iran and discovering that 54 nations respond through military deployments, through resource cutoffs, through asset seizures, and through coordinated retaliation that costs exceed any benefit from destroying Iranian facilities. Impose sanctions and lose resources that industries need more than we need markets that alternatives provide, creating mutual economic destruction where your losses exceed ours because industries employ millions while our populations adapted to hardship through decades of exploitation. Attempt isolation and watch developing world choose our side because shared experiences of exploitation create solidarity, because alternative narratives resonate more than propaganda, and because our coordination demonstrates that resistance succeeds when sufficient nations align. Try dividing us and discover that your pressure strengthens unity rather than fracturing coordination, because external threats create solidarity, because previous attempts taught us your methods, because institutional frameworks survive personal conflicts, and because demonstrated success validates cooperation, making reversal politically costly. Every response you attempt fails not because you lack capabilities, but because your capabilities target wrong vulnerabilities, because cross-domain warfare attacks from directions your defenses don't cover, because coordination creates collective strength exceeding individual weaknesses, and because preparation means I anticipated responses and developed countermeasures before taking irreversible actions. This is what permanent end of your dominance looks like in operational reality rather than theoretical possibility. No negotiation, because negotiations imply that outcomes remain uncertain when structural forces determine results. No mercy, because mercy implies that we possess dominance requiring restraint when actually we seek balance, not revenge. No reversal, because reversal requires recreating conditions that disappeared permanently through structural changes. Only cold reality that power distribution shifted from concentration to distribution, that hegemony ended through coordination, and that multipolarity emerged through alternatives, making your dominance unnecessary regardless of whether you accept transformation gracefully or resist futilely. Your unipolar moment that seemed permanent when Soviet collapse left you as sole superpower is finished after merely 3 decades because hegemony requires not just material preponderance, but also acceptance by others who lack alternatives, making subordination rational. Material preponderance you maintained through defense spending exceeding next 10 nations combined. Acceptance you lost when alternatives emerged, making subordination optional rather than necessary, when coordination made resistance viable rather than futile, and when successful challenges demonstrated that your dominance was contested rather than assured. The multipolar future begins now as operational reality regardless of your acceptance, because China possesses economic might, because Russia maintains military capability, because our coordination provides collective strength, because alternative institutions function adequately, because technological diffusion spread capabilities globally, and because confidence replaces fear, making resistance normal rather than exceptional. And you're discovering that being one pole among several feels like defeat when you spent 75 years as only pole that mattered, because psychological adjustment from dominance to equality is difficult transition that few empires manage gracefully, and that your exceptionalism makes particularly traumatic. Watch carefully, because this transformation is your future trajectory. More alliances forming as other regions replicate our success, more coordination emerging as nations learn from our example, more resistance appearing as confidence spreads through successful challenges, more defeats accumulating as challenges multiply faster than you respond, until you finally accept what I already know from studying history and observing present. Your dominance is over permanently, and only question remaining is whether your decline is managed through strategic wisdom, accepting reality, or chaotic through resistance fighting inevitable transformation. I prefer managed decline because chaos harms everyone, including us, through economic disruption, through conflict escalation, through refugee flows, and through instability that development requires avoiding. But I'll accept chaotic decline if you force that outcome through refusing to accept reality, through doubling down on failed policies, through escalating conflicts you cannot win, and through wasting resources on restoration attempts that structural forces ensure fail regardless of determination or resources committed.